1916, the bloated, castrated body of a man was dragged from the freezing waters of the Neva River in St. Petersburg. Almost beyond recognition, it was later identified as that of the most notorious monk in history.
He's a superhuman force of evil at the heart of the monarchy.
Hundreds of thousands of people died because of the incompetence of the government, of the ministry, and that ministry influenced by Rasputin.
It's widely believed in the upper reaches of society that this man is really the source of all of Russia's problems.
To his enemies, Grigory Rasputin was the incarnation of evil. He destroyed anyone who dared to cross his path to power. Implicated in murder, corruption, and the eventual destruction and execution of the Romanov royal family, Rasputin was instrumental in wiping out the 300-year-old dynasty and changing the history of Russia forever. In a remote village in deepest Siberia, everyone knew Grigory Efimovich. As a teenager, his shameless exploits had earned him a reputation as a thief, a drunkard, and a womanizer.
His name comes from the Russian word Rasputin, which means dissolute, so he obviously spent many of his childhood years getting drunk and getting up to no good.
By the time he was in his teenage, he was a sort of tearaway. I mean, there was a sort of gang of toughs in the village, and he was the leader. So much so that they would be paid by the priest to stay away from Sunday worship, for example, because they were so disruptive.
Unwelcome in the Orthodox Church, Rasputin began to search for an alternative path to God.
Evidently, he showed tremendous interest and curiosity and a deep sense of spirituality which others witnessed. So he was on the way to becoming an important figure in the religious scene of Russia at the time.
Rasputin was never ordained priest, and he didn't become a monk, although on occasion he claimed to or pretended to be that.
Rasputin discovered a heretical cult who believed that only after a man had sinned greatly could he truly be repentant and pleasing to God.
He's really the member of a sect, of which there were many in Russia. Rasputin's sect, probably the Khlisti as they are known, we translate that as the flagellants, the idea that they whipped themselves into a state of ecstatic frenzy where they had religious visions. And they, like many sects, believed that Christ was embodied in ordinary peasant people.
The Khlisti rituals consisted of meeting in secret places, forest glades perhaps, or cellars, where they would whip and dance and twirl and stamp and chant themselves into a state of ecstasy, into a frenzy. In Russian it's called radienie. They would then engage in group sex, in orgies. And the purpose of this was both to indulge in the sin of the flesh, in order then to be purified, to repent, and to abstain once again.
Despite Rasputin's involvement in the cult, he married a local girl and started a family. But he was not destined to play the doting father for long.
He seems to have seen the light and went on a pilgrimage, so he claims, which probably means that he spent some years wandering around Russia and picking up the reputation of some sort of mystical type.
From the very beginning, it was clear that Rasputin was different from other boys. He showed from an early age that he had something like second sight. He had these very hypnotic, powerful eyes, which seemed to sort of be the center of his personality.
Assuming the role of holy man and healer, Rasputin set about corrupting countless God-fearing peasant women.
He could argue, you know, if you want to come to Christ, you want to come to God, then you have to sin first. And I can be the medium through which you can sin. And it's documented that many women fell for this line. His technique was quite straightforward and uncomplicated. He would simply tear open the girl's blouse. It's a very crude and primitive male chauvinism that he practiced.
Before long, this potent and dangerous combination would lead Rasputin to the royal capital of St. Petersburg.
St. Petersburg 1900 is a very vibrant cosmopolitan place. Orthodox members of the aristocracy are beginning to flirt with ideas of theosophy, with Ouija boards and seances. Rumours begin to circulate in the early 1900s of this guy Rasputin, who has curious healing powers.
In 1903, Rasputin arrived in St. Petersburg with an appearance far from regal. He was a shaggy figure, with a sable coat thrown over peasant boots and a blouse.
He smelled a bit like a goat, apparently. He had long, rather greasy black hair, a thick black beard, which people said was covered in last week's dinner.
He parted his hair in the middle and combed it kind of over his forehead, because apparently he had a bump on his forehead he wanted to hide. Other people would say it was like a horn he was trying to hide when they want to compare him with the devil. He was pretty repulsive looking.
Even his eyes held no warm religious feeling, and were often described as the eyes of a maniac. In the first few years of the 20th century, Russia was suffering massive domestic disorder, as well as the constant threat of foreign invasion. The rich sought amusement, and the church needed a boost.
So the church was looking for genuinely spiritual types from the common people. And likewise, the monarchy was similarly looking for people like Rasputin who could give it some sort of divine authority.
His reputation as a preacher had preceded him, and he had an entree into high circles within the church, and from there into the aristocracy and the royal family.
Tsar Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra lived a life of opulence and luxury, in extraordinary palaces, furnished with gold, and anything their hearts desired. The one dark cloud was that the heir to the throne, Alexei, suffered from haemophilia, an agonizing blood disorder thought incurable.
The Empress was desperate for someone to heal her son, the Tsarevich Alexis, because she had brought haemophilia into the Romanov family through her own family of Hesse. She saw her son's illness, the first male heir to be born, as a punishment from God.
In November 1906, Rasputin was summoned to the royal palace at Tsarskoye Selo to see if his mystical ability to heal could help.
It seems that he was able to stop the bleeding of Tsarevich on occasion, whether this was by hypnotism or by simply his presence, which seemed to have a calming effect, or whether it was because he comforted the mother, who was hysterical.
With the illness of Alexei becoming progressively worse, the Empress was convinced that only a miracle could save her son.
An incident in 1912 really sort of fixed his position there. The Empress was out riding with Alexis, and he had some sort of fall, and the internal bleeding began. In her desperation, the Empress telegrams Rasputin, who's at home in his village in western Siberia.
And by return, he sends a telegram back saying, "God has heard your prayers and seen your tears. The little one will not die. Tell the doctors not to bother him too much." Miracle of miracles, the next morning he recovers, the bleeding stops. That sealed it for Alexandra. A miracle had occurred.
And from that point on, Rasputin's comings and goings at the court became more frequent.
This finally secured Rasputin's position in the royal palace and his place in Russian history forever. With his position in the palace secure and the assurance of the Empress's protection, Rasputin set about abusing every rule in the holy book.
He was a dual character if ever there was one. He could go straight from the Tsarevich's bedside, where he was praying fervently for his recovery, to the brothel down the road. He would boast about his mystical powers as much about his powers as a lover. So, in a sense, his two careers were going apart in parallel.
It's like a pop star suddenly being a star overnight and don't know what to do with their money or their fame and their power, in a sense. And he had this wonderful power now.
For the ladies of the aristocracy, there was undoubtedly an element of piquancy in this grubby man. This sort of peasant type wandering around the palatial apartments of the aristocracy was obviously an object of fascination.
When socializing with the aristocracy, Rasputin would take immense pleasure in insulting his social superiors.
There'd be a sexual edge to his humiliations. He would dip his grubby little finger in a pot of jam and make one of these princesses lick it clean.
She takes it from him. She does do what he says. She obeys him.
No woman was safe from his advances. The recently widowed Kionia Bilyatska turned to Rasputin for spiritual guidance. She recalled their fateful meeting in her diary.
He instructed me to prepare myself as a woman and began to do what a husband alone is permitted to do. He forced me, caressed me. He then did all he wanted to the end. I felt dirty, impure, for he clearly felt it necessary to subject me to perpetual testing.
Untarnished by his lewd actions, Rasputin split his time between the palatial apartments of the well-to-do and the royal chamber of the Empress herself.
So from about 1912, he's a frequent fixture in the private apartments of the Empress, where he acts, in a sense, as her confidant, her confessor. She obviously took great comfort in his presence, not least because of his calming influence on the boy.
Rasputin was well aware that as long as the prince was alive, he had run of the royal house. The Empress's trust was paramount to Rasputin's quest for fame and power.
Those who were in government positions didn't want the Empress to hear that they were fighting Rasputin. Anybody who didn't like Rasputin lost their job.
The seats of government were filling up with fortune hunters and incompetents, many of whom were happy to pay large amounts to Rasputin for the position.
The best way to describe him is as a fixer. He had acquired so much influence at court that he could really almost do anything. He could make a bishop. He could unmake a bishop. He could ensure that somebody was advanced in a ministry. He even made prime ministers and unmade them.
Russia's last chance at honest government was the Prime Minister Peter Stolypin, who was compiling a file of evidence against Rasputin.
He had to prove to the Tsar and Tsarina that this man was evil. He collected this huge file of all these scandals that was going on. The file proved that Rasputin was debauched, that he could make Mama, who was Tsarina, and Papa, the Tsar, do what he wanted them to do, that he could manipulate them. And the fact that the people thought that Rasputin was having an affair with Alexandra. And he wants Nicholas to believe him, to say, look, here's the evidence, this man has got to go. Nicholas saw the information and he knew it was true. But when he showed it to Alexandra, she claimed it was all lies and that he was being persecuted because he was a saint, and all saints are persecuted.
Not long after, Stolypin was murdered, shot in the Kiev Opera Theatre whilst attending a royal function with the Tsar. With his number one enemy out of the way, Rasputin's corrupt influence on government was becoming increasingly evident.
We had 4 prime ministers, I think 5 ministers of the interior, 4 ministers of agriculture, 3 ministers of war.
Instability was seeping through the slack reins of government and onto the city streets. The St. Petersburg papers were bursting with letters from rape victims, crude cartoons, and articles rich with scandalous allegations.
There's a rumour mill which is taking over, and Rasputin is at the centre of all this. And there were all sorts of companies producing postcards, stamps, souvenirs. There's one which is a picture of Rasputin standing behind the Empress with one of her breasts in his hand. And it says simply, "Samoderzhavie," the Russian word for autocracy. So his holding of her breast was a symbol of the autocracy, which was his hold on the whole Russian state.
With the very framework of Russian society in disarray, Russia went to war with Germany. Papers were filling up with the names of dead soldiers.
Russia is at war, it's going very badly, and the Tsar, in what was to be a fatal error, decides to take over the command of the army, leaves the capital, goes off to the front.
And he leaves Alexandra in charge of the government. She is to watch over the ministries. That was her job. But she doesn't do this alone. She calls in Rasputin as her advisor. And from this period on, this is when he's at his height of his powers. She just put her faith and trust in this Rasputin, and anything he said went.
Rasputin's influence was spreading all the way to the front line, with devastating consequences.
Nicholas, as the commander-in-chief of the army from 1915, was obliged to take the advice of his senior commanders, and they were very aware of Rasputin's malevolent influence.
And in letter after letter to the Tsar, we see this pleading, this nagging, this begging, you must do as this man says or Russia will go under, it will lose the throne, our child will never sit on the throne unless you listen to what Rasputin says. And poor Nicholas, knowing what Rasputin was, trying to ignore her, trying to put this to the side, trying not to answer her, but she is determined, and eventually he gives in almost on everything.
By replacing the war minister with Vladimir Sukhomlinov, a money-grabbing, incompetent and close friend, Rasputin signed the death warrants of millions of Russian soldiers.
It was a disaster. You had soldiers without rifles, or you had rifles without bullets. In certain circumstances, they had bullets and rifles, but one didn't go with the other. And soldiers were in summer uniform, and winter was coming, and you had people freezing to death. They were basically engaging in a 19th century war against a 20th century enemy. They were being slaughtered on the battlefields, absolutely slaughtered.
Millions of Russian soldiers were marching towards certain death. As the trenches were filling up with untrained teenagers, generals were taking their own lives.
In 1915, the war turns dramatically for the worse. The German machine of metal breaks through the Russian infantry and forces them into a retreat.
As Mother Russia mourned her loss, people were beginning to demand some answers. All fingers were pointing to Rasputin.
Soldiers' letters back from the front all suggest that they explained the defeat of the army in 1915 as not just the incompetence of the government, but as active treason within it. Rumours were beginning to circulate that there was a pro-German bloc, giving the German commanders secrets about military manoeuvres, in which Rasputin and the Empress were the main culprits.
Palace authorities tried to dampen the stories. Rasputin kept the fire alight by spreading wild rumors about his passionate nights with the Empress.
There was one very famous occasion in the restaurant of the Yard where in 1915 he took a few prostitutes and began to get drunk and to play with the gypsy ladies, and he made these gestures with his hands saying, "Oh yes, I can make the Empress dance to any way I fashion."
Rasputin once ran out on the balcony, waved his private parts to crowds beneath, shouting, "This is what rules Russia."
What counts is not whether the rumors are true or not. It's the ability of these rumors to spread, enter people's mind as if they were truth.
Rasputin had become a living legend, whose own judgment day was drawing near.
Rasputin is demonized. The monarchists blame him for bringing the monarchy down. The people who are opposed to his influence over the monarchy, members of the inner circle of the Romanov family, who see his influence as disastrous, the senior police, senior members of the government. When all of these people decide enough of Rasputin, then I think the final story is already scripted.
In the small hours of a cold December night in 1916, Rasputin was driven to the palace of the Tsar's cousin, Prince Yusupov, for what he thought was a secret tryst with a beautiful woman.
When he turned up in his shiny silk shirt, best leather boots, ready to meet this beautiful hostess, he was invited down into the basement and given poisoned Madeira. It didn't seem to have any effect on him. He was given some cakes which had cyanide. Again, the guy seemed to be as robust as ever. At this point, Yusupov becomes impatient, goes to his office, collects a pistol, comes down again, shoots Rasputin twice in the side. Rasputin falls to the ground. They believe he's dead, and the conspirators take away his coat. In their absence, he gets up again, staggers out of the doorway into the courtyard, where he's found and shot again.
They begin to think that he's actually the devil incarnate, and they can't get rid of him.
Yusupov's frustration was so great that he allegedly castrated the man he referred to as Satan.
They start beating him with a rubber truncheon and kicking him. They finally get him into a car.
They then drive him away and dump him in the river, where he's washed up a couple of days later.
Grigory Rasputin was finally dead. Within 3 months of his murder, the Tsar lost his throne, and the royal family were imprisoned and later executed.
If there wasn't a Rasputin, they probably wouldn't have fallen so fast as they had, and so disastrously. They were really hated, and hated most probably because of Rasputin's involvement with them.
The revolutionaries see him as the embodiment of everything that was evil about the old regime. And they use his image to frighten the people, so that if they betray the revolution, they will get Rasputin, they will get the Germans coming back, everything evil will return.
Rasputin's body was later exhumed and burnt by the revolutionaries as a symbol of the complete annihilation of Russian imperial government.
History Night concludes after the break as we head off to the battlefield to hear about the medicine men who risked their own lives to save those of others.